Hi, Nick Park here from Evangelical Alliance Ireland, and once again I'm here to remind you that it might be Friday, but Sunday's coming. Over the last few days, there's been great concern in the country that while we've made great progress against the coronavirus, that there has been a rise in the reproduction rate of the virus, and it looks like there's a hiccup or a pause in the return to normality and coming out of lockdown and crisis. Really, what this means for church leaders is that we continue to lead in a time of crisis, in a time whenever things are constantly changing. And look, I've been in Christian leadership now for over 30 years, and I've been through several crises. I've been through crises where leaders have had a moral failure. I've been through crises of great financial emergencies and things like that. And I've watched some amazing leaders and how they have led through crises. And I've also watched some other leaders that were not great leaders, but they were good leaders, and they did a really good job of leading through a crisis. And one thing that this whole coronavirus thing has re-emphasized once again for me is that to lead in a time of crisis, you don't actually have to be a great leader, but you do have to be a good leader. You know, sometimes we have this notion that what we need is a Winston Churchill figure that will just be so inspirational, just so amazing, they'll get us through the crisis. And that can cause many of us in leadership to feel inadequate because we're not a Winston Churchill figure. We're people with a calling from God upon our lives, and we want to serve the people of God. Well, the great news I've got for you today is that when you look at what's happened around the world, the countries that have dealt well with the coronavirus, the countries where they've got it under control, the countries where they've managed to minimize and reduce deaths and flatten the curve and inspire the population to make the necessary sacrifices, have generally not been countries with great leaders, but they've had good leaders that have done their job well. Even in our own country, I'll be honest with you, the government that we had leading us during the early stages of this crisis was not a government that I voted for. But I have to acknowledge that while I would never consider them great leaders, I think they've done a good job. Because there are several basic things that are required of leaders at a time of crisis. And this is true if you're a pastor, or if you're a head of a family, or if you lead a network of people, or a prayer group, or anything else. There are several things that leaders need to do whenever they lead in a time of crisis. Number one is good leaders don't minimize the problem. They, where leaders have said, this thing, it's just the flu, it's just a dose of flu, the results have actually been devastating. Those countries where leaders have said that kind of thing are where people have been dying in the largest numbers, because it produces a mixed message, and people do not then take with a crisis with the seriousness that it needs to be taken. Now, I'm not talking about engendering fear. I have to say, I encounter very little fear, both in the church and in the nation, to do with this with this virus. But there is a sense that it is a problem, and it's a big problem, and it's one that we need to take steps to address. Good leaders don't minimize the problem. Next thing is this: good leaders don't pretend that they know everything. They surround themselves with experts, and they listen to the experts, and they take advice from the experts. They don't insist that they know better than the experts. We've seen one or two occasions in nations that have not dealt well with this crisis, where leaders contradict their medical experts and shut them up and don't allow them to answer questions. And even though it's obvious to everybody in the room that the politician doesn't know anything about what they're talking about. So good leaders listen to the experts. And I would say this, that even in churches at this time, the churches that has thrived in this time is where leaders have been humble enough to listen to their tech people about what should be different in the online services. They've listened to people who advise them on safety measures that must be taken when opening up churches again. So good leaders listen to the experts. The third thing that good leaders do, leading in a time of crisis, is that they are consistent in their message. They don't say one thing one day and then undermine it by saying something the next. They keep saying the same thing, and they keep saying it consistently so that everybody understands the message. I have been impressed in our own country how all the leadership, the political leadership, have stayed on message, and that has motivated the people in the nation to make the sacrifices that needed to be made at a stage whenever we were very close to being tipped over into an absolute mess in our hospitals. Again, it's because good leaders are consistent in the message that they share during a time of crisis. The next thing, number 4, is that good leaders are humble enough to admit when they made a mistake. Now you might say, hang on, you've just been saying you got to be consistent. Yes, you do have to be consistent. But as well, you've got to understand that there are times whenever we make a decision on the best information we have available to us, and then we learn more. That's quite natural and quite normal. Now, obviously, it's difficult to do that if you're insisting you already know everything before you start. But if you're humble enough to admit you don't know everything, and then you can make changes and corrections in your course. I remember years ago reading about the first mission to take man to the moon, that it wasn't just a case of pointing the rocket in the right direction and saying, that's our course, off we go. But all the way along, every moment of every day, there were experts that were basically carrying out tiny, tiny corrections, evaluating where they were on course. Are we still on track? Are we still on track? Do we need to do just a little correction this way, a little tiny correction that way? And leaders are humble enough to do that. One of the things about the current crisis with the coronavirus is that our knowledge of it has been changing all along. So certain things that at the beginning of the crisis thought this actually isn't very valuable for fighting the virus, they're saying, well, actually, now it is. Now, some people get very cynical about that and say, they don't know what they're talking about. But even the scientists are dealing with something that is totally new, a virus they've never encountered before until the tail end of last year. And so good leaders are humble enough to say, you know what, we may need to carry out a correction here to how we were doing things. The fifth thing is that good leaders don't make the crisis all about them. If we're leading anyone in a time of crisis, then the main thing is not about how good we look or how good we don't look in this thing. The main thing is not justifying ourselves. The main thing is not telling everybody that we can handle this crisis better than anybody else. The main thing is actually not trying to be a Winston Churchill, but simply leading the people well. So don't make it all about us, because it's not. We are there to serve. Servant leadership is the style of leadership that Jesus modeled. And a good leader knows that they are there to serve the people that God has placed them in leadership to. And so that is a servanthood position. So it's not all about me. It's about the people that I'm leading and serving. And then the final thing I want to say, the sixth thing is a good leader lets people know that they understand their pain. We're talking about being empathetic. I will say this, one of the things that did impress me about our political leaders in Ireland is that they were consistently saying, we understand how hard this is. They used personal examples of people that were struggling at this time. And they didn't just say, shut up and shape up. They actually said, we understand how difficult you're finding this, but it's really important that we keep pulling together and that we defeat this virus. And that's another characteristic of good leaders, that they empathize and let people know that they are feeling their pain. So 6 simple principles for leading in a time of crisis that all of us that are in leadership are still going to need in the days ahead, because we still are in a crisis. So we shouldn't minimize the problem. We listen to the experts. We be consistent in our messaging. We don't go off on a rant somewhere. We be humble enough to carry out corrections in what we're doing. We don't make it all about ourselves, and we let people know that we're feeling their pain. Yes, we may never go down in the history books as a Winston Churchill figure. That's okay. But we lead people and get them through a crisis. And while being a good leader is really what's needed right now, God's not looking for necessarily for great leaders, but he is looking for good leaders. Because one thing this crisis has taught us is that bad leadership is absolutely drastic in a time of crisis. It magnifies all the weaknesses of bad leadership. So I want to encourage you to be a good leader in this time of crisis. And I do believe, as I look at the Church of Jesus Christ throughout Ireland, we've got so many good leaders that are doing a great job. Thank you if you're one of them and watching this video. May God bless you. Have a wonderful week. And don't forget, it might be Friday, but Sunday's coming.